Hi and welcome. Today my guest is Sasha Handley, Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Manchester, author of Sleep in Early Modern England, Visions of an Unseen World, and a good deal more besides. So we'd like to keep the introduction short here, so I'll put your full academic profile in the links below, which has links to your work, etc. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Lovely to have you, and now what is
Bumble the dog.
and little Bumble there. So yeah, let's get straight into an early modern bedroom. So in your book, Sleep in Early Modern England, you use probate inventories, which are basically lists made when someone dies and they walk room by room, valuing stuff. Take us into a early modern household, maybe like Samuel Dennett in 1688. Walk us through what was found in these houses, what was downstairs, what was upstairs, and maybe you can take us through some of the language, things like bolsters and bed sacks and what they are. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Probate inventories are a real treasure trove of information about the ways that people slept and where they slept and the kinds of materials that they surrounded themselves with at bedtime. In the period that I study, so from the early 16th century up to the 18th century, we actually see quite a significant change in the parts of the house that people had their beds and their kind of sleeping textiles. So at the start of the period, you tend to see most of the main beds in the household situated on the ground floor in a sort of multifunctional room. And those beds would typically be surrounded by curtains or in cold places, parts of Scotland. They even had beds built into the walls, things called box beds, that had wooden doors to enclose the sleeper at night time and to keep the warmth in. And those, the curtains and the shutters also allow you in the daytime to kind of shut that part of the room off so you can carry on cooking or doing whatever other tasks the day brought with it. So that changes significantly, and beds are relocated for a lot of people to the upper floors of the household. And the poshest bedroom in the house would be the one directly above the parlour, so the living room as we would know it. So when we see lists of beds and bedding in something called the parlour chamber, that's an upstairs room that was really the first time that a specific room is sort of specifically dedicated to sleep and nothing else. So in middling and upper sort households, you tend to see that transition a bit more quickly. The poorer sorts are still, I think, living in a smaller number of rooms, probably in multifunctional rooms. But you do see that kind of spatial relocation of sleep in our period, which is a really interesting change. And yeah, I guess you also asked me about the kinds of things that you would typically find in a sleeping chamber, someone like Samuel Dennett. So again, depending on what sort of person you are, there's a massive range of sleep materials that you might have had at your disposal. Height is really important for beds. The higher a bed, the posher you are, is the general rule. So that takes into account the bed frame itself, which was usually called a bedstead, but also the number of mattresses that were stacked on top of it. So a very posh person like the Duchess of Lauderdale, for example, who used to live at Ham House in Richmond in the 17th century, she had 6 mattresses, all stacked up one on top of the other. Usually at the base, nearest to the bed ropes, at the bottom of the frame, you would have a thicker filled mattress with something like horsehair in it to give you that stability. And then the closer you got to the body, the mattresses would be filled with softer, more luxurious fillings. Usually animal feathers, goose feathers were expensive and sought after. But for the poorer sorts, you would have one mattress filled with all kinds of things, from cheap woolen material called flock, to different leaves and plants as well, some of which had antibacterial qualities. Beech leaves, for example, were used to stuff the mattresses of some children because they were absorbent and thought to be good for bedwetting, if that was an issue. But we also recently discovered something called a cat's tail plant, which grew in marshy and fenland areas in Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. And in the summer, they have fluffy seed heads on the top of them. And they were being harvested and used for mattress stuffings for the poorer sorts as well. So foraging could be a really useful way of sort of making up your sleeping quarters if you didn't have the cash to spend on a goose feather mattress.
Really interesting. You mentioned the change from upstairs to downstairs. So there was always an upstairs, and previous to it being a bedroom, we always, at least in the UK, we assume bedrooms are upstairs, kitchens are downstairs. And when you walk into a house that does it the opposite, you sort of kind of double take. What was the upstairs used before it became a bedroom?
I think, well, servants often slept upstairs, but the upstairs was also used for storage of lots of grain and corn, for example, because it was less likely to flood. So I think that's one of the uses prior to this period. But there's a big shift in building materials as well that happens in the 16th and 17th centuries. So we start to see a lot more brick buildings and stone houses as well, rather than wooden constructions. So these spaces were better defended from the elements, and I suppose that gave people a bit more flexibility to rearrange the usage of different spaces within the home. But you also see a change in the number of people who are living in any one individual household. I think that starts to shrink across the course of the period. So you've got a smaller number of family members, children and household servants than used to be the case. So I guess that pressure on space becomes a little bit less pressing for a lot of people.
Prior to the shrinkage of people in space, what kind of, are we talking extended family, cousins, like what, so before the shrinkage, how big was this kind of?
Yeah, so there would have been multi-generational families with grandparents living alongside grandchildren, but also a lot of the, so in big country houses, a lot of the tenants and servants might also have been occupying those spaces at bedtime as well. But I don't have huge expertise on this particular question, so perhaps my medieval colleagues will be able to come and speak to you next and fill you in on a bit more detail.
Definitely something I'll take them up on. To what degree is fireplaces and access to heating, etc., changing the layout as well?
Yeah, I think fireplaces do become more commonplace in domestic homes. There was always a hearth tax on fireplaces, which for a lot of people meant it wasn't financially viable to have one. But once you start to get homes with an increasing number of windows, you also want to have ways of heating spaces up more efficiently. So fireplaces do become more common alongside staircases and other borders or internal space dividers within the home. So you see an increasing number of doors, hallways, and a breaking up of a large open space into smaller, more specialised rooms across the course of the period.
I mean, this sounds like a huge improvement in standard of living. I mean, it paints a fairly grim picture of what was going before. I mean, the implication is very few windows, quite dingy, dark, very cold, and I'm guessing that mattresses were used for a long time, and you mentioned this sort of stacking of mattresses, which reminded me of the Princess and the Pea.
Exactly.
And
Yeah, it's a really good analogy for what's actually going on in a lot of houses.
so I wonder, how thick are these mattresses? Can just to paint a picture for the audience of sort of I mean, they obviously can always go to Google and check, but I'm just wondering what sorts of things are we looking at visually? How thick are they? What sort of sizes are we talking?
Yeah, I mean, I think for those mattresses that were stuffed with really firm materials, like horsehair, for example, they're not actually that dissimilar to a standard depth of mattress that we're used to today. The difficulty, of course, is that hardly any of these things survive from the period. And so, whilst you can often find archaeological data about what these things tended to be filled with, or I can find textual records, for example, from the Worshipful Company of Upholders, who regulated mattress stuffings throughout England in this period. It's really rare that you find an existing example of a mattress. I did, though, at the Museum of London, the Museum of Rural Life in Reading. That one is from, I think, Hampshire, and it's filled with plant reeds that were common in the south coast at that time. And that mattress has only survived because it was in a monastery or convent, I think, at the time of the Reformation. And because the monasteries were dissolved and all of their goods kind of distributed to different places, that mattress ended up being used as insulation in the attic of a home. And so it wasn't used and then destroyed in the usual manner. So mattresses would have had, I think, a shorter shelf life in this period because they were filled with those natural fillings and fibres that had their own life cycles of degradation. And, if a mattress had been used for somebody who had had a baby, or if somebody had died in their own home, which was very, very common, they were usually burned after that had happened for hygiene reasons. So it's very rare to actually find an existing example. But yeah, the inventories typically just tell us what's inside these things rather than their dimensions, physical dimensions.
Just to go through a couple of terminological things.
Yeah.
So we have a bolster, we've got bed sacks. What are these things in the modern bedroom?
A bolster is that's a term that's still with us. I suppose it is now today used as a divider in a bed between two people who were sharing it and perhaps didn't know each other that well. That was certainly one of the functions of a bolster in the period that I study, but they were also used as basic pillows as well. So you typically find bed and bolster together in the probate inventory descriptions of the soft furnishings of a bed. And of course the inventories only list things that had a significant resale value. So there's a really lively second-hand trade for beds and bolsters. And bed here also typically refers to a mattress. Mattress is not a common term until the later 18th, 19th century to describe the sort of bed stuffing that we now associate with the word mattress. So bed and bolster would have been mattress and stuffed pillow, basically.
So is this where, if you had a guest arrive at your house with whatever their hygiene may or may not have been, you would allow them to hop in your bed and just stick a bolster between you? Is that how these things work?
You could do, and it really depends on how much space you've got available to house your guests. But people put an awful lot of thought and labour actually into housing overnight guests. It's a really common practice in this period. So if you had enough space, a guest would have had their own room with their own bed and bedding textiles. But if it's a more modest household, you would find ways of accommodating them that fitted the social mores and the sort of Christian ethics of the period. So that would be letting somebody co-sleep with someone of the same gender, and someone of a similar social status as well. So servants very often shared beds if, their masters were visiting one another. But there were very clear guidelines about who should and shouldn't be sleeping with whom. But yeah, there were a lot of fold-up beds as well that would have been used on a temporary basis when guests came to stay. There were things called bed rolls, which, you might think of a little bit like a yoga mat, I suppose, that you could roll up and just stash in a cupboard or hide behind a door, and they could be rolled out at night time if temporary guests came to stay and space was limited. But yeah, the probate inventories show us that special sets of bedding textiles were often kept for guests that were considered important. So you'll often find a reference, for example, to Holland bed sheets and pillow bears, which sounds a little bit alien to us, but Holland refers to the best available quality of linen bedding that you could source in the period, which came from Holland, where the linen weaving was very high quality. And the pillow bear refers to a pillowcase. So something that bears a pillow, literally, is the meaning of that word. And you would have sort of designated bedding textiles that said, for guests, in a wealthy household.
I'd say very bougie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So in popular accounts, normally there's the two extremes. You have a kind of the rich person inside a feather-filled four-poster bed,
Yeah.
and the poor person sort of stretched out on the floor. And it's the space between these two extremes that I think people know the least about. So you're speaking about mattresses and what they're filled with. Was there utility, like each area had its own access to its own kind of natural fillings and therefore used them? Did it go with what was antibacterial, and to what degree was that stuff even understood? Walk me through a little bit like mattress fillings.
So to your last point, absolutely, people understood the material qualities of the things inside their mattresses. They deliberately sought out particular plant species that were known for being soft and comfortable, or that had other qualities that you might be interested in having for your bed stuffings. So this is a period in which botanical literacy is huge. Yeah. So domestic households are the absolute centre of botanical expertise in these years. Whether you're using it for bed stuffings or for preparing your own medicines, people were incredibly knowledgeable about where different plant species grew, what kinds of beneficial properties accrued from those locations. So, for example, anything that grew in standing waters or close to a coast was often associated with having cooling properties, and that was really, really sought after at bedtime, because people understood that the best way to fall asleep easily was to keep a cool sleeping space and to have cooling bedding materials. That's why linen was also really sought after. So foraging is common, but of course a lot of people would purchase a ready-made mattress from an upholsterer as well if they could afford to do so. And they were very careful, I think, about the choices they made. And when we look at account books from this period, we also see really frequent payments for the restuffing and refreshment of mattresses as well. So there would be somebody in your local community who was a specialist at that particular role, and you would get them to come in once a year or once every 2 years to refresh and restuff your mattress.
So if you were kind of on the kind of the equivalent of the working class today,
Yeah.
what sort of mattress might you have, and did it get covered in some sort of more comfortable sheet? Like, what was your bedding like?
Yeah, so something like a simple flock filling would have been really typical for a labouring household. Um, that's a warm and durable material, so catering more for the cooler months than the hotter ones, but that was pretty typical in those days, especially since we know households weren't terribly warm. But pretty much everybody slept in linen bedding textiles. So whilst Holland linen could be expensive to purchase, lots of people had the means to forage or grow flax and hemp, spin their own linen fibres, and make their own bedding. So it's something within everybody's reach, but of course there's a sort of huge variety in the quality of those linen textiles. The finest were very smooth and incredibly soft, almost silky to touch. And I have touched some of them because some of these things survive in museums like the Victoria and Albert Museum, whereas others would be much rougher and less refined linens. They wouldn't have quite the same bleached white colour as the posher sheets, but that cooling quality that is linked to sleep is something that actually cuts across a surprising number of households, no matter how wealthy you were.
So if we just move through the bed to the pillow, so that obviously everyone assumes pillows as being this kind of nice soft rectangle thing,
Yeah.
but when you look in ancient China, for example, I mean, people slept
Porcelain.
on ceramic pillows. So what was the English conception of a pillow, and how important were pillows going back for sleep?
Um, Pillows are crucial, I think, at least in the period that I'm most familiar with. Um, they are, of course, things to ensure that you have the right sleep posture at night time. And in the medical advice literature on sleep posture is really important. Um, Generally, medical practitioners advised people to sleep with their heads slightly raised on pillows, creating a gentle slope between the head and the stomach, because sleep was incredibly important for the process of digestion in these years. And if you had a slight slant to your body, that would prevent food being regurgitated during the night, which would wake you up, which would also disturb your sleep. So there was lots of advice about that kind of body angle, but also which side you should be sleeping on, at which part of the night. So people would typically start on one side and halfway through the night would turn onto their other side to distribute the heat evenly throughout their body, because the digestive process thought to be kind of going on the whole time that you're sleeping. So pillows are crucial for health reasons, for comfort reasons. I also get asked a lot about whether early modern beds were really short compared to today. And I think that is a perception that's sort of been picked up from art history, portraits and imagery of the period. I think the answer to that question is no, they're not any shorter, nor are people very short in this period, but they tend to sleep slightly propped up, and so you look like you're slightly more contracted when you see images from the period. Sleeping on your back, though, or directly on your belly, thought to be quite bad for you. On your back, you're likely to have more nightmares, because in a medical culture where the theory of the four humours predominates, sleeping flat on your back would open you up to the brain being flooded during the night with unhelpful humours that could overwhelm you. That position is also thought to invite nightmares. from demons that come and prey on you in the night. So yeah, there are lots of rules in the medical literature about how your body should be in bed. Of course, we can only guess at how closely people followed those prescriptions.
I definitely want to come back to some of the more medical, religious side of sleep. I'm wondering about the evidence. Walk us through, obviously, you're trying to reconstruct some things like in probate inventories. Some things, like you mentioned, are soft furnishings, much harder to know in detail about.
Yeah.
How did you combine different kind of strains of evidence to try and reconstruct something? And in what way were you able to avoid the kind of survival bias of what ends up in probate inventories in this reconstruction?
Yeah, it's a great question. You can, for example, compare the evidence of probate inventories to pauper inventories or inventories from workhouses, where we know a lot more of the poorer sorts were living, especially at times when they were really struggling to sustain themselves financially. You can also look at parish records to see which items are being gifted for the support of the poor. So they will often list particular kinds of basic household materials, and the bed is pretty much the most important item of furniture or soft furnishings that anyone can have, irrespective of the size and complexity of the household. So there are those other helpful records. We also worked a lot with personal testimonies, where people would often describe the kinds of things that they're using for their servants' bedding, which, you know, often contrasts in interesting ways with other members of the household. But we have also, as part of the Sleeping Well project, done some remaking experiments. So we had a collaboration with Ordsall Hall in Salford, which is a fantastic Tudor house, and we used some of the probate inventory evidence to remake a mattress that we filled with oat chaff, which was really easy to forage or cheap to buy, and easy to kind of refresh after a year or two. And it's surprisingly comfortable. We also tried stuffing pillows with straw and with different scented herbs that we know people were routinely using in and around their beds at night time. And we always tend to think about those sorts of bed stuffings as, you know, uncomfortable and a bit sort of prickly, but actually it wasn't at all like that. And Ordsall Hall actually have the oat chaff mattress available to the public, and the school kids that go there absolutely love trying it out and are always really surprised at how nice it is to lie on. So yeah, we combined different kinds of material and textual evidence with some of those remaking experiments that got us a little bit closer to how things might have been in the past, although of course you never replicate things exactly as they were.
I have to admit, when I was reading about straw-filled pillows, etc., I mean, it sounded fairly itchy, fairly prickly. Has anyone ever slept on one of these mattresses, or?
I mean, not throughout the night, but we did do an event at the British Academy a few years ago where we had a straw-filled bed available for people who were coming through the exhibition. So lots of people did lie on it and were reluctant to get off it, which I took as a good sign.
That is a great sign. So another inventory that you reconstructed was John Ellis's parlour chamber. And he had feathered bed, but he had also 3 trundle beds, he had a cradle. So he has a single room, but he has like a whole nighttime community in there. Yeah. Talk us through what that was like, how that interacted with the mores of the time, the sorts of dilemmas that would put people through.
So I should probably explain what a trundle bed is to start with. So that is typically a bed that is quite low to the ground, made of sort of basic wooden pallets, but it has some wheels so you can move it around, and you can store it underneath a higher bed, for example, in the daytime when it's not in use. So they're really common for servants in bigger households, but they're also really common for visiting sleepers. If it's harvest time, for example, you might have employed some temporary seasonal workers to come and help you out with that, and it often fell to the landlord or the farmer to house those people at night time. So yeah, there could have been quite a lot of people occupying a single space. I guess in terms of the dilemmas that you mentioned, we're back to, the slightly murky world of sexual assault, violence that can happen at night time, that did happen at night time, which is one of the reasons that people were keen to segregate the sexes in terms of their sleeping arrangements. If people were sleeping in sort of transitional spaces where lots of people were sort of passing by them, they often do crop up, unfortunately, in court records, because people have reported some form of assault during the night. In lodging houses as well, co-sleepers who shared a bed but didn't know each other. There were often examples of thefts, people stealing money or clothing during the night and disappearing off before the other person woke up. Or there could be more physical violence as well that resulted in serious injury or death. So there were important considerations to take into account when you're sleeping in close proximity to somebody, because I think, as we're all still familiar with now, people are at their most vulnerable when they're sleeping. You're not aware of what's going on around you or who or what might be preying on you, whether that's another human or some sort of bed bug. So ideally, you would have some prior knowledge of the people you were sharing a space with. There would be a level of familiarity or trust between you before you decided to share a bed with somebody. But of course, that wasn't always possible. So yeah, we do see the darker side of these arrangements, if that's the right phrase to use.
And I think it's also important to remind people how dark it would have been at night, especially in many of these places where there's not maybe many windows. So even if the moon or the stars are out, it's still very dark, and
absolutely.
And not everyone has that choice to choose. But even when it comes to families or multi-generational families, obviously you still have the issues of the man and woman of the house being able to do their family life stuff. You've got kids potentially 2 feet away from you. How did all of that work?
Or in the same bed sometimes.
Or in the same bed. Yeah. So how did that all work? Just on a daily basis for the average family?
Yeah, I mean, space could be really constricted. And, we often only find out what that might have been like when things go wrong. That's when you tend to find reports of things that are happening in different households, whether there's been, illicit sexual activity, or, in other instances, if a relatively young baby is in the household and they're sharing a bed with a mother or a wet nurse, there were quite a lot of accounts of them being overlaid, which is sort of accidentally smothered in the night time. So yeah, there are a lot of considerations safety-wise to juggle and comfort-wise. I sort of, when I think about these questions, I often try and comfort myself by thinking, well, they spent most of their time outdoors. So during the daytime, perhaps that was where you got a bit of spatial separation and freedom. And I guess, this is a society that's much more like physically active than we are now. So I think levels of tiredness were probably much higher. And people are not sitting up on their mobile phones at night time to disturb people nearby to them. So, yeah, I mean, it's a bit of an unknown, to be honest. But, yeah, there is certainly some things that you probably wouldn't want to swap think of introducing into your own world today.
Absolutely. To what degree was there a whole etiquette and kind of social relations between the sorts of people that you would, in the same way that you don't just invite anyone nowadays for a meal in your home with your wife and children.
Yeah.
If you're choosing to share your bed with someone, is that potentially an expression of affection or esteem? To what degree is there a known etiquette
Yeah.
around these things?
Absolutely. There is a really strong one. And bonds of friendship and trust were often crucial to the decision to share a bed with one of your friends. We know, for example, from the colourful diaries of Samuel Pepys that he co-slept with lots of people, and he wrote about some of those encounters with great pride when they were judges and important naval officials and, people who liked to converse with him about their musical tastes at night time. He always talked about those episodes in a really warm and happy manner. At the same time, he also had some negative experiences with some of his co-sleepers. So those who talked too much, for example, and kept him awake for too long, and also those who were snorers. So we do find quite a few personal accounts of people complaining about poor sleep because they've been sleeping next to somebody who snores like a pig. And they have terms of abuse for people who are troublesome to share a bed with as well. So I think bed faggot is one of them. Often quite, colourful words that were used to denote displeasure. So, I think ideally you would want to test someone out before regularly sharing a bed with them, but it wasn't always possible. So,
And I was thinking about movement too. Obviously, some people move more than others in their sleep.
Haven't got any pocket sprung mattresses just to keep you stable. Yeah.
To what degree were curtains? When did they become a big thing, and to what degree were they used both in domestic settings, but maybe also in inns and taverns, etc.?
Yeah, I probably know less about inns and taverns, but some form of window covering is pretty ubiquitous. Doesn't have to be curtains, but curtains can come in a very wide range of materials with different kind of cost associations with them. Even if you couldn't afford to buy a fresh pair of curtains, we find a lot of people adapting older textiles and turning them into window coverings and other things around the household. So we've got some really great examples that still survive in local museums and galleries. Manchester Museum, for example. People had a housewife would have a pretty well developed set of needlework skills, so they're able to kind of keep textiles alive for longer, if you like, by turning them into other things over time. But even if you don't have curtains, there's all sorts of other things that you can use to cover a window. So cheesecloth, waxed or oiled paper, for example. We do find some instances of those things being used as window coverings, which perhaps didn't cut out the light quite as effectively, but certainly softened it and filtered out the highest levels of brightness. So I think whoever you were ideally looking for a cool and a dark place to sleep in. And of course, if you've got one of those lovely box beds that I talked about earlier, or a bed surrounded by curtains, then that's ideal, isn't it? Because you wouldn't have any light infiltration in those kinds of constructions. And box beds are, they're not exclusive things. They're often something that people would have invested in when they got married. So some of the examples that survive have still got the initials or the names of the people that had that piece of furniture made. So yeah, and they, they're important legacy objects as well, these beds. They're passed down across multiple generations of a family. So yeah, we shouldn't necessarily always think about the poorer sorts having, incredibly low quality or problematic sleeping quarters. There's a real mixture.
I'm quite interested in the concept of privacy.
Yeah.
When this was really kind of came home to me is, and I know this is a kind of different period, but I stood on Hadrian's Wall and you could see the housesteads where the soldiers slept, and we know there was like 8 to this tiny space, and many of them had wives. Just absolutely no concept at all of private anything. And nowadays we have a very developed idea of privacy. Over the period of time that you studied, do we see this developing idea of privacy? Do we see the idea of family life suddenly becoming more private from the children, etc.? So maybe in the beginning of the period, marital life would happen in front of the children, and then later that migrated. How do we see that change happen?
I mean, I think probably the general rule is that if you could afford and had the space to separate out your sleeping quarters from your children or other members of the family, then you would. There's a really strong set of Christian ethics around these sorts of household practices, but it's always a balance between what's possible and what's desirable. Yeah, the whole privacy discussion is a really complex one. It's not a word that people often use in relation to their own sleep practices, but at the same time you can see in material terms that sleep is being moved upwards and outwards to more enclosed, bounded spaces in the household. So that's not a very good answer to your question. I probably need to go and refresh my memory about some of the testimonies that I read quite a long time ago when I was writing the
book. to be fair to you, this is many years, and I've just dragged you in to try and see what could still be dragged up.
It's a tricky one, because in the textual records, people really don't talk about privacy very often.
So it's
and
definitely
actually, on a lot of occasions, there are good reasons not to want privacy, to actually favour security and warmth. This is especially the case, for example, for women who are sleeping in homes when their husbands are not there. So I'll come back again to Samuel Pepys's wife. She often invited their female maidservant to share her bed with her when Samuel was away on business. I think probably for warmth reasons, but also for safety during the night. We know that Elizabeth I had lots of her ladies in waiting sleeping very close by to her during the night, and I think that's for comfort, so they could attend to her if and when she needed something, because she was not a very good sleeper by all accounts. But it's also that security concern as well. She's a person who often felt vulnerable, and was the subject of multiple assassination attempts. So I think that question of safety and security is one that often overrides the desire for privacy that we're so familiar with today.
It's really interesting, actually. Sort of the implicit things that are not mentioned obviously can reveal just as much about the things that are mentioned, because I guess if you were to read anything today about sleep, privacy would probably rank quite high.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And that would probably tell you about the kind of things we take for granted today versus the sorts of things that people were worried about.
It's also a very Western idea of personal space as well. Yeah. There are lots of communities around the world today where privacy in sleep is not particularly sought after as the sort of key requirement at bedtime.
Same with toilet practices. What a huge change that has been in the modern world compared to, I mean, especially when you go to a place like China, which is only developed for a much shorter period of time, the older generation. So I've got friends whose parents very well remember, my in-laws very well remember.
Yeah.
They would sit on the toilet in an outdoor space, and they were chatting to to the people next to them, which is something that would be unconscionable today.
Yeah.
But like I say, these things are very kind of time specific.
Yeah, very culturally distinct as well as historically distinct. That's right.
You were talking before about beds being handed down as being these sort of expensive, important parts of the family's capital, if you like. In the book, you say, quote, approximately 1/3 of the total cost of household goods.
Yeah.
So this is a really major store of family wealth.
Yeah.
This is not an ordinary piece of furniture. What made a bed worth that level of investment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is not just because it's important to sleep well. Obviously that is important, but the bed represents so much more in terms of early modern society. So we've just been talking about privacy, but your household would be a surveilled place, a place where your friends and neighbours entered, looked at what you had, made an evaluation of you as a person, you as a sort of household manager, partly dependent on what kind of bed you had and what your bedding textiles were like. So it has a kind of material status as a sort of representation of household wealth and hygiene. So it's important to maintain from that point of view, because it reflects upon your family's credit. And credit is a really important word and concept in this period, because depending on your social credit or the esteem in which you and your family are held, that would translate into everyday transactions, financial transactions in your community. Whether local tradespeople were going to give you a tab, essentially, because they knew that they could rely on you to settle the bill at a certain point in time. So social credit is crucial, I think, in relation to particular household furnishings. But if you also need to think about what else happens in a bed. So we've already talked briefly about marital sex, about childbirth, and also about death. Those crucial life cycle moments are all centred around the main bed in your household. So those uses are often materially represented in the kinds of carvings that you get on elaborate wooden bedsteads. So you'll often have fertility symbols like pomegranates, for example, which is so many seeds in it and looks really bounteous. You'll often see those kinds of meanings literally inscribed into the bed or its textiles. And therefore, the bed is absolutely crucial to the longevity of a family and its estate. So it's crucial for successful procreation and for the continuation of the family line. And that line of inheritance is incredibly important in this particular society, where the law of primogeniture applies. You need to have, a healthy boy usually to pass on all your goods to. And, a couple of generations down the line from when a bed might have been originally carved, you would look back at some of the visual representations on that bed and, be able to trace a family line and therefore establish yourself as a significant family. For very wealthy families, you will often have heraldic symbols carved onto the bed itself, or big finial posts that have a particular meaning for your family lineage and pedigree. So I think that's also incredibly important, and that's why people also take such care to maintain these things over time. So household recipe books are absolutely stuffed full of methods to cleanse the bedstead, to keep it free of bugs and pests. Some of the recipes are really quite severe, like using sulphur and like really combustible things to protect that crucial piece of furniture. So yeah, it's much more than a place to sleep.
So this is
It's a place to do life.
Yeah, so this is an object infused with kind of familial legitimacy from, who inherits the bed must have been quite a big deal.
Absolutely, yeah.
Full of superstition, the different things that are happening in the bed and how important they are. And it's also a kind of, I didn't fully understand if it was sort of financial asset or if it was more of a signal that you were a respectable person, or maybe a bit of both.
It's both of those things. I mean, ideally, you probably want to keep the bed, but we do find examples of people who've run into hard times financially, who are having to have their beds valued and potentially sold, and they're incredibly sad and often fight tooth and nail to keep hold of these things.
Amazing.
Especially for widows who, whose husbands have died and left debts that they need to settle.
And the bed presumably holds all this meaning.
Yeah, a lot of meaning, personal meaning. It's a site for recovering from illnesses throughout your life as well. So it's a sort of medical space. It's a space to renew your family and continue the line. There's so many reasons that people are attached to their beds.
I mean, it's really sentimental sounding. I mean, it could be the place you were born.
Yeah, usually.
The place where maybe your parents breathed their last breath.
Yeah.
Births, illnesses.
So the bed sheets, when a person died, they were often wrapped in the linen bed sheets that were last on the bed, and that would be sort of sewn down the middle as a shroud. Which explains why, which links to my other project, when you see a visual representation of a ghost from this period, they are like bursting out from one of these bedsheet shrouds.
Interesting.
So that link between this life and the next is also something that kind of centres
You mentioned
on the bed and its materials.
Sorry, I was going to say, you just mentioned birth and illnesses on these beds, and that just made me think about hospitals and how clean hospitals are.
Yeah.
If someone got very ill or they had a birth on the bed, did they have to then kind of get rid of that mattress or restuff it? Or
you would typically burn a mattress that someone had given birth on, which comes back to that question of survival, is why so few of these things have actually been kept over time, because they are bits of, they're furnishings that get really dirty and smelly and full of, bodily fluids and things that would harbour illnesses to future users. So childbirth or death would absolutely be, the end point for most mattresses.
So let's move this to the medical realm. You were saying before about having to be propped up in this kind of raised head, certain body positions, going to sleep on your left, waking up on your right, all this sort of thing. So talk me through from a medical perspective, if you were to give the kind of perfect instruction to the early modern person of how they should sleep and why, what are the kind of main things that they might worry about?
So I mentioned it before, but they would worry about perfecting digestion during the night. So the sort of physiological model of sleep that prevails in my period of history is one that dates back to the ancient Greeks, to Aristotle. And that model, and this is a very simple version of it, basically says that during the night, the food that you've consumed during the daytime gets intensively heated up in the stomach. The hot air rises from the stomach up to the cold and moist brain, and then that hot air starts to turn into little specks of almost rain-like fluid that then descend back down the body cooling it down and sending it to sleep. And the nutrition in your food that you've consumed gets purified and dispersed around the body, and eventually the liver, which was thought to sit directly underneath the stomach, almost like a little cooking pot, that was the place where purified blood was replenished for the next day's use. So sleep's absolutely crucial medically, it was thought, to digestion, but also the reproduction of blood, until we get William Harvey's model of blood circulation, which is very different, but that doesn't really become influential in ordinary people's practices until the late 17th or well into the 18th century.
One of Galen's huge mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. So that Greek model is incredibly important for guiding the ways that people approach bedtime and sleep. So they would often time meals, for example, to stop a couple of hours before bed. They would avoid eating or drinking certain foods that were going to disrupt their sleep because they were too rich, or they would be more likely to regurgitate during the night. So, I mean, the advice you would typically give would be kind of endless. Watch what you eat, keep a consistent bedtime, that was really important. Consistent hour of retiring and rising if you could. Pray before bed, ask for God's protection whilst you're unconscious and vulnerable during the night. Make sure your chamber was as calm as it could be, as cool as it could be, comfortably. Make sure that if you could, you had herbs, scented materials that would promote sleep by cooling your body and your brain down, particularly. Start the night by sleeping on your right side to intensify the heat under the stomach, and then halfway through turn onto your right side so that.
So she's starting on your left.
I think it's that way around.
I think I can't remember.
Whichever way it is.
I think
you flip from side to side.
Yeah.
Don't sleep on your back.
Yeah.
Don't sleep on your belly. That's often described as sleeping like a kind of servile person or creature, and I think has links back to biblical descriptions of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So it's a sort of untrustworthy position to sleep in. There are, of course, exceptions for people who are pregnant, for babies, for older people who can like nap during the day. Napping typically is not recommended for normal, healthy adults, but exceptions are made if you've got physical conditions that mean your nighttime hours are a bit curtailed or disrupted. And yeah, I guess people, there's a big debate, which I'm sure you're probably about to ask me about biphasic sleep. And
I was intending to get to biphasic sleep.
So this is a theory put forward by an American historian called Roger E. Kirch, who has identified a pattern of segmented sleep in pre-industrial Western Europe and early America, where people supposedly slept in two separate phases during the night, which they referred to as their first sleep and their second sleep. And Kirch describes the interval in between those two phases as productive, as a time when you might have spent some time reading, having sex with your partner, finishing jobs around the household, doing something active and useful before returning to bed for your second sleep. It's a theory that has become incredibly influential in sleep science studies, contemporary sleep science studies. It has also drawn criticism more recently from historians who see the phrases first sleep and second sleep as contingent and flexible, with multiple meanings. And, you know, we do have a lot of evidence of flexible sleep timings depending on a person's occupation and status. So a lot of farming communities, for example, really couldn't keep a regular pattern of segmented sleep because of the nature of the work that they had to do throughout the year. But it has remained a really influential theory, and I think is a very interesting one for contemporary sleep experts and medics to think about, and to sort of contrast the cultural and also the material environments and contexts in which communities slept and now sleep. I think that helps us in the modern world to think about what is natural and what we have kind of instituted as a 21st century sleep community that might not actually be terribly helpful.
I think this biphasic sleep question is really interesting. I just want to stick with the health thing for a second. I mean, they're
Sure.
kind of both interlinked about what constitutes healthy sleep.
Yeah.
What I found quite interesting is even though a lot of the theory is based on Galenic humours, the advice is fairly
Sensible, right?
sensible modern advice.
Familiar.
Yeah, don't eat, close to bed, don't eat heavy foods,
Yeah.
a lot of very,
Do something relaxing before
yeah.
bedtime.
When did we move from the Galenic idea of the stomach and the liver producing heat, etc., to sleep being about the brain and the nerves?
Yeah. So that's the 17th century development. I'm very convinced of that. The two things are kind of separate but related. So William Harvey's demonstration of the continuous circulation of the blood, I think he publishes that work in 1628. It takes a while for it to sort of filter beyond an elite kind of medical network. But it's in the 1660s with a guy called Thomas Willis, a doctor, where we see very significant, I hate to use the word progress, but I'm just going to do it, progress, in terms of the associations between sleep and the nerves, the body's nerves. So he does lots of anatomical experiments that identify different parts of the brain and associate them with different physiological functions, and that included sleep. So he comes up with very influential theories. He's the first person to coin the term neurology, I think, as in neurological, to describe a lot of sleep disorders, things that we would think of as sleep disorders today. So for him, something like catalepsy, coma, all different gradations of unconsciousness that he associates with particular nervous conditions or states of the nerves. And the late 17th and 18th century, at least in Britain, sees the emergence of much more neurologically centred explanations of sleep, but also treatments for disorderly sleep, if you want to put it that way. So calming the nerves became almost the most important thing you could do to treat poor sleep, rather than things centred on digestion.
So would it be fair to say that the idea of what good sleep meant in the mind of a person totally changed? So maybe in the Galenic period, it was more about settling, the humours, the body, and now the perception is all about the mind and settling the mind. Is there a complete shift in how people appraise themselves having had good sleep?
I'm not sure I go quite that far, at least not for my period. partly because I think the humoral model persists well into the 18th century for a lot of people. So I'm not quite sure how rapidly and comprehensively the sort of neurological model of sleep filters out. But we do see more sleep tonics and sleep medicines involving ingredients that would calm the body, that would still the nerves. But actually, irrespective of which physiological model of sleep you pick, I think there's an enormous amount of consistency in how that translates into everyday practices, bedtime practices that safeguard sleep. The things that you would do to balance the humours are actually really similar to the things that you would do to calm the nerves. So I don't know how many of the more modest households in my period would have understood the sort of physiological foundations of what they were doing. I do think they understood the importance of the head being treated at bedtime, but whether they fully understood the sort of nervous models of sleep put forward by Thomas Willis and other members of the Royal Society, that I don't know. I'd be more cautious about that.
But the outcomes would have been very similar.
I think the outcomes are really similar.
Your book says something really quite interesting. It says, I mean, you say, quote, that sleep was to give or to destroy life, to craft or to ruin reputations, and to smooth or obstruct the path to heaven. So there's a lot of there's a lot at stake here in sleep. That's both health wise, also reputational, and religious. Walk me through that a little bit about.
So your health is considered to be a gift from God, and it is something that you need to proactively take care of because it is a gift. And so Christian understandings of sleep are really important to the ways that people approach bedtime and how they interpret different patterns of sleep as well. So it was seen as a sign of being a good Christian to keep temperate sleep practices. That's a word that you see absolutely everywhere in the medical and the religious literature. And that is just, temperate being moderate, basically. So you would keep regular hours. You wouldn't be out socialising until the early hours of the morning, typically. You would be getting up at a reasonable time in the morning to say your prayers. The fact that you had been protected during the night was also thought to be something in God's gift, which is why, as bedtime approached, people would focus their prayers and ask for protection. In the morning, when they got out of bed, they would offer a prayer of thanksgiving for having been looked after during the night, because even though humans are unconscious, people very much believe that the devil and his minions were really active at night time. In fact, this is when the devil's power peaks, during the hours of darkness. So you could be preyed upon by all sorts of demons infiltrating your dreams or cutting you off from life. And so if you hadn't actually prepared yourself as if to die at bedtime, that would have consequences potentially for you in the afterlife. So people often think about sleep in this period as a sort of miniature death and resurrection, and that's how you sort of prepare yourself at night and then in the morning afterwards.
I was going to say, sorry, go on.
I think I've missed probably the point of your question. I've gone carried away.
Not at all. But you've described the health side, which is the give or destroy life, the obstruct the path to heaven, and you've described a good reputational angle. And I think the reputation thing is, I mean, to some degree relevant today, but it's really quite interesting that your sleeping habits really could say something about you to the whole community. And I was wondering if men and women had different standards apply to them when it came to sleep?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it gendered? I think it is, and I think you probably see that most obviously when housewives are being evaluated on how time efficient and busy or not they happen to be. Probably around pregnancy and childcare as well, because it's going to be females of the household who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting there, especially in a child's early years. I don't tend to see an awful lot of critique of unruly sleep, if you like, amongst caregivers. So that probably occupies an exemption category for early modern people. But this is something that is definitely important in religious terms, the comparison of your own sleep, for example, to your neighbours'. And I do find some quite comical accounts of people looking around their community as they're off to hear morning prayers at the local church, just watching to see who else's curtains are open or not, and kind of congratulating themselves that they're up a bit earlier, because they do very much feel that an early riser is somebody who's likely to, catch the worm or get an extra blessing from God. So there's a sense of one-upmanship in terms of people's hours of rising, and I think retiring as well, probably.
Some things never change.
Yeah, exactly. But, this is a period where religious tensions run incredibly high, and where you're sort of constantly looking to reassure yourself that you've picked the right side. And you're looking for signs of God's blessing. So yeah, those kinds of things do go on. And people also draw regularly on biblical terminology to insult people who they think are a bit too lazy. So they often use the word sluggard or slug-a-bed for people who just sleep too long and are thought to be kind of lazy and a bit indigent.
Fantastic insults from the period.
Yeah, there's some really colourful insults. Yeah, they're great when I came across those.
In the modern day, we have a very clear distinction between the spiritual and the medical kind of preventative type behaviours. And even for the very religious who see them as somewhat linked through God, there's still a somewhat clear distinction between the two. But the way you're describing how preparations were made, it seems like corruption of the soul and the body had a very closely, even though we had this idea of the Galenic humours, which is an almost non-religious concept.
Sorry, the dog's scratching at the carpet now.
Yeah. He's more invited to come and join. I think he's feeling a little bit left out. Come on. I need to give him another treat. But I'm just wondering, when we see this much bigger distinction in the way that people perceived preparation for bed as being something medical versus something religious, and the separation of the two.
Yeah, they're really not separate in the period that I study, not at all. Because physical health is so intimately bound up with the health of the soul as well as the body. It's Descartes, isn't it, who's keen to sort of pull those things apart, but I don't think his theory went down particularly well for a really long time. So yeah, it's not something that I've tracked the end of in my own research. I'm guessing that people who have thought more closely about that question have looked to the later 18th or early 19th century with the coming of industrialisation, more overtly secularist movements, to document the slow pulling apart of those philosophical categories. but I don't really think it's amongst the people that I can access. I can't think of a single instance of somebody who was questioned whether they should be praying at bedtime. Whether they had time to do it, that's a different question. But if they have the opportunity, the examples that I've come across, they're all doing it.
Let's bring back the popular biphasic sleep thing. I mean, when you were mentioning before the idea of people doing useful activity in between the two sleeps, we'll get to the how legitimate the idea is in the first place. But I was just immediately had the question of, well, not everyone could afford lighting at night. Lighting was very expensive, and until the early modern period where price of lighting goes down. How was that a practicality for maybe your poorer folk?
So yeah, this is it's a common assumption actually that the sun setting and rising is a really powerful determinant of people's activity levels. But there's been some great recent research by historians like Mark Halewood, who's looked at court records in a lot of rural areas in the early modern period. He's actually found some surprising evidence of this not being such a barrier to labour and nighttime activity. We've actually done, as part of my project as well, we've done some research on lighting technologies that were available to early modern householders, and there's actually a huge range in terms of cost, but also availability of different light sources. So things like Rushlights, for example, were often incredibly cheap, or didn't cost anything, because you could literally make them by foraging some rushes near where you lived and using the leftover cooking fat from your pan to coat the rushlight plant with. This is one of the experiments that we actually did out at Ordsall Hall as well with some members of the public. We actually forested these rushes, coated them with animal fat, let them dry, and then lit them. And they were surprisingly powerful. Gave you a good half an hour's worth of light into the evening, where you could continue with your needlework or whatever it is that, or brewing, for example, which is a really common nighttime activity in the household. But we've also found a huge range of different animal-based oils that were used for lighting. Even things like glowworms in a jar were great for night fishing. You could take them with you so you lit your way, but you could dangle them also on the water to attract the fish. So there's all of these ingenious technologies that people had devised and kind of deployed to keep a flexible schedule, if you like. I think that's, I think I would like to tell more contemporary sleep scientists about all these things, because I don't think you really can rely on the times of sun setting and rising to determine the length of the working day or the length of the sleeping night. There's so much more complexity to it when you start digging around for more evidence.
I mean, this is a hugely interesting and new kind of perspective that you've opened up to me, but it also, from a common sense point of view, living in the northern hemisphere, this far north, I mean, in the winter it's dark at 4 o'clock. If you couldn't do anything from 4 till about 9 the next morning, not
just
much
didn't happen.
It just didn't make it wouldn't have made a lot of sense.
It didn't happen. And actually, you also shouldn't underestimate the difference of the night sky in a pre-industrial area. I think you mentioned a while back the importance of the moon and starlight for lighting activities, and I've come across farming guides that basically say you can send the harvest workers back out if the moon is bright enough for them to work by. So there are lots of ways in which people had access to light at night time. So I think it's a much more complex picture than the one that we've been used to.
Very much so,
We're digging around a bit more in that in the next few years.
Definitely something I want to read more about, because it's something I've had these two kind of parallel thoughts in my head, both the kind of impossibility of nothing going on, but also the kind of data that you get on the price of, you know, lighting in the pre-modern era, and how expensive it was and how the prices have come down.
Yeah. Things like beeswax candles could be expensive, were expensive, unless you'd stolen them from the parish church. Some people did. But tallow, not particularly expensive. But when you think about ordinary household practices, like, you know, using cooking fat and then making your lights out of that and some rushes out your back door, really not that challenging.
It makes a lot of sense, yeah. I mean, you did some recent work with Holly Fletcher, and I think you guys found many remedies which were seeking undisturbed rest. How does that dovetail with the idea of biphasic sleep?
Yeah, so that's the recent article that Holly and I have published together. You know, we used several hundred recipe books and recipes relating to sleep as the foundation for that article. And I guess we were just surprised that literally none of them made any reference to first sleep or second sleep or biphasic sleep. There often is a gap between what a written medical recipe says and how it was sort of put into use. So it doesn't necessarily preclude segmented sleep practices, but we were surprised by the absence of that terminology in the evidence that we looked at. And I guess when you start to think about some of the ingredients that people were using to secure sleep in different contexts, you know, they're using poppies, opium-based sedatives that, you know, would have been very powerful, and they clearly understood that because they were really careful about the dosage instructions for anything that had laudanum or opium in it, and that was all adjusted according to, you know, whether you're a child, adult male, and how sick you were as well. So they were very careful and precise about dosage, but these are tonics that would have put you to sleep for a long time. That might be because you had a fever and the body needed time to restore itself to health. But yes, the pursuit of undisturbed rest potentially presents, you know, it's difficult to reconcile that with a near universal pattern of segmented sleep, I think. But in the context of illness, you know, perhaps those things are not as incompatible as first seems.
We'll get a little dog on the tree.
Do you have a dog, by any chance?
A couple.
Yeah, your dog.
Oh,
Nice.
good boy.
Bumble, it's your lucky day.
All right. So there we go. Happy dog.
He's a
people.
happy dog.
You've got a real good expertise on recipes, and it's a really interesting kind of view into the past. There's issues of bed bugs. You talk about aniseed and rosewater under the nose, remedies for all sorts of things. But we're also living in a period of galenic humours, so maybe a remedy could be good for one body and harm another body and all that sort of thing. Without going crazy into the weeds on this, walk us through this, the kind of interesting insights you've gotten from all these.
So we made a database out of all the sleep recipes that we found, so that we could come up with like a top 10 soporifics of the period. Roses are absolutely up there; they're the most soporific form, most widely used. And we found things that we expected to find, things that had cooling and moistening properties. Lavender, which everyone knows is still associated with sleep, chamomile, things like that. But we also found a surprisingly large number of ingredients that would have been classified galenically as hot. And And when you actually look at how they're being used, they are ingredients that temper the temperature of very, very cold things like rushes, for example, which could, according to herbals at the time, could be deadly because they were too refrigerative. So you would use something warmer, turmeric, aniseed, nutmeg, to take the edge off. And I think that's absolutely crucial to making sure these recipes are appropriate for different bodily complexions. That the complexion is a word that's used to indicate the specific balance of the four humours in your body or my body. They would have been very different, partly because, you know, we occupy different genders, but also every individual had their own makeup in terms of the volume of the different humours.
Just to fill in for the viewers, you've got hot, cold, wet, dry,
Yeah.
and then the balance, and then and a combination.
So hot, cold, wet, dry all correspond to elements in the world: fire, water, etc. So achieving the ideal balance between all those four things was what you were always aiming for in humour or medicine. That was the thing that was meant to keep you healthy in the long term. And this is a medical culture that's very much preventative in tone. So people tried to maintain good health by living a well-balanced life to stop illness coming to them in the first place, because it was much trickier to treat illness after it had arrived than to try and ward it off. So that is the crucial goal. Medicine in the period, yeah. You made a rod for your own back there, Luke. It's like best mates.
You describe sleep as a fluid, vulnerable state of existence between life and death. And that vulnerability has taken us to medicine, to religion. But there was also the idea of noises in the night. And this sort of takes us to the other subject that you have written quite a lot about, which is
Ghosts.
all your ghosts. So we've got the old Geoffrey and the woman in the Epworth Rectory.
Yeah.
Talk us through the basic idea of how people perceived the ghostliness in this period.
Yeah, so actually there's quite a significant shift. So when England is a Catholic country, ghosts are typically thought to be the souls of dead people that return to the living from the middle place between earth and heaven, which is purgatory. And that is purgatory is a dynamic state of spiritual cleansing that almost everybody would have to go through before they reached heaven. Of course, the really, really bad people go straight to hell, and they can return as ghosts too, but typically it's that middle place, purgatory, that's thought to be where ghosts, escape from temporarily with some sort of mission, and with God's permission usually, to come back to the living and deliver a message. With the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation that is sponsored by Henry VIII in pursuit of divorce, amongst other things, the boundaries of the afterlife are completely redrawn. So purgatory is scrapped by Protestants. They put that in the bin. They think that's not part of the original scriptures that they approve of. And so it creates this sense of confusion. Ghosts really shouldn't be coming back to visit the living, but they continue to do so. So people really struggle to find a reasonable explanation that fits their religious position in this period. But the ghosts just keep on coming, and a lot of the reasons that they keep returning are very consistent as well. They come back shortly after death to comfort a loved one, to reassure them that they've gone to a good place after they've died. They come back to reveal a hidden secret, that they might have been assaulted or murdered, or someone's stolen money from them or withheld money from somebody still living. They come back to describe wrongs that need to be corrected. And that is what led me to the Epworth Ghost episode.
How long does that transition take in the literature to go from the sort of Catholic view to the sort of more Victorian Protestant view?
Yeah, so we often speak of a long Reformation. There's the sort of judicial and legal side of things, and the restructuring of the church, and those things are much more easily dateable, and a kind of reasonable start and end date can be identified. But the slower process of social and cultural change, of a mindset change, is, I think, much longer. So it's clear to me from my research on Old Jeffrey, which is a haunting that happens in 1716, that the older model of ghostly returns is being heavily critiqued, but hasn't completely disappeared. That said, the family involved in this particular haunting, one of them is a minister of the Church of England, and so is very clear about what Protestants are supposed to believe about ghosts. But when a ghost turns up in his own home, it's surprising how quickly he turns to some tactics that we might associate with other confessions. So, yeah, it's amazing what can happen when the problem is suddenly yours and really immediate, rather than a philosophical question.
I really find this quite interesting, because obviously in the modern day, belief in ghosts is much diminished. And you could argue in the Catholic period, belief in ghosts was very dovetailed well with the faith. But when the Protestant Reformation happened, we have an opportunity there for people to go, oh no, these aren't really ghosts, it's just noises in the night. What was going on that made people so convinced that ghosts were a fact of life that needed them to kind of contort themselves in such a way to provide a new explanation for it, which we don't do today?
No, we don't. Well, some people do. I think it's difficult as a 21st century human to put yourself in the position of somebody in the 17th century who genuinely believed that something supernatural was nearby, had invaded their house, had come to talk to them. I think the idea that God had a care of the Christians under his charge, if you like, was incredibly powerful. Perhaps, even became much more powerful after the Reformation. And so the question really is how God's messages manifest themselves in the world. Protestants didn't completely rule out the possibility that some sort of supernatural creature could return to talk to you, but a lot of them reframed what we would previously have referred to as ghosts as the visits of angels or demons, which were completely legit for a Protestant God, who was all-powerful, who could choose in exceptional circumstances to get involved and try to, sort a particular problem out. And so it's in those terms, really, that a lot of Protestants were much more comfortable discussing visitations and thinking about, what were the signs that this was an angelic messenger, and what were the signs that this was some sort of demon in disguise trying to tempt them into some kind of sin or false belief. So there's quite a lot of anxiety in some of the cases that I've come across over the years, people trying to figure out exactly like where this thing has come from. But the fact of their, being is much less of an issue, I think. It's only for much more extreme religious skeptics, people that we might call atheists at the time, but who still did believe in some sort of God, that didn't think those visitations were a possibility. Not sure that answers your question particularly well, but
no, again, I'm very quite interested in just introducing people to this topic. You have obviously a lot of fantastic anecdotes and stories. We have, like we say, with rectory, etc. I wonder if you were to have a student and you were going to introduce them to this whole new area of study from scratch, how would you introduce the topic, and would you go via kind of these stories? Would you go through the kind of concept of belief or understanding of ghosts? Or
well, I have taught this for many years. I always try not to make a judgment about what people believed, but to support my students in understanding how particular sets of beliefs were possible. So what are the foundations on which these kinds of beliefs sit? How does the religious culture of the period support the idea that these things are real and important? I try not to. I always get the question of, "Oh, were they really there then? Or were they really ghosts, or were they not?" It's unanswerable, and as a historian, that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the particular social and intellectual conditions that make these things a prominent part of people's everyday lives and discussions. So what are the contexts in which ghosts typically appear? How do people describe them? In what ways? In cases where fake ghosts might have been imagined, what are they being used to say? So they're the sorts of questions I try to guide my students towards, rather than, is it real or is it not? Because I can't answer that. And even though I've never seen a ghost myself, I wouldn't want to rule out the possibility that there's something out there that is beyond my comprehension. Yeah. So that's how I try to do it in the classroom, at least.
before we bring this to a close, I just wanted to talk about the idea of generally in the study of history, there's a common thing that's said that we could, especially when speaking about ancient history, how difficult it is to kind of embody or the mind of a person from the past, and how even though things might seem quite logical to us, these people are so different to us.
Yeah.
And there's a big debate about to what degree this is true, and I'm wondering from the perspective of this whole other world that we just don't really engage with anymore, this whole world of ghosts and the unseen. I mean, your book's called Visions of an Unseen World. In the modern day, the idea of an unseen world is very foreign to some degree. To another degree, we have it with us every day. We have electricity, we have internet, we have all sorts of unseen things that we live with. But this idea of an unseen world of spirits, I wonder how different you feel that constituted the mind of a person in the pre-modern period.
So what just recap for me
So to what degree
you want me to answer?
To what degree would you say we could inhabit the mind of a person from that period?
Okay.
Like, how different does this make their fundamental view of the world that you would say you couldn't imagine what it would be like to be a person in this period?
Yeah. I mean, it is the challenge of being a historian, isn't it? To try and get as close to that as you can. There are schools of history that declare it an impossibility, absolutely. So perhaps the best you can do is approximate and try to put your subject position to one side. I'm not sure that is ever 100% possible. But for me personally, I try to understand the period and its people in their own language, in their own terms, I try not to look for answers to contemporary questions in the past. I try to figure out what are the preoccupations of these people in these communities that I study, and so work from that evidence upwards to create my own historical questions to pursue. I hope that's the right way around. There'll always be some historians who'll tell me that I'm doing it wrong. But I suppose that strangeness, that sense of alienness, is actually what drew me into the study of this period when I was a student, because I found them so quirky and strange in terms of what they were doing. I just thought that is so different from the kind of world that I live in. I really want to try and understand why they're behaving in that way, how that is possible. So that's always been the main driver for a lot of the work that I've done, actually, to look for the weird and the strange and try to make sense of it. Not from a contemporary perspective, but in that particular society and community or family, how much can I find out about the dynamics that are underpinning some of the strangeness that I can then help to translate for some of my readers.
Have you ever been tempted to bring something from that world into the modern world, some sort of habit that you've read about, or some recipe, or something you thought, you know what, that sounds like a great idea?
I mean, I've tried out some of the sleep recipes that have been actually very effective. Haven't really indulged much of the supernatural practices. I haven't gone into any of the range of protective practices that households often use to sort of ward off an unfriendly spirit, whether that's sort of burying a witch bottle under the door threshold, or carving protective marks into the woodwork around doors and window frames.
I think people would love to hear a recipe from the past that you found effective.
Oh, well, just really simple things about controlling body temperature at bedtime. I found incredibly useful. So if you go and have a hot shower or a hot bath at bedtime, your body starts compensating for the heat by sending its internal fans, if you like, into much quicker movement. So your body temperature drops much more quickly. So actually for getting to sleep, relaxing the muscles, but also for reducing body temperature, that's a really good one. I've tried out some of the essential oils as well that were really commonplace soporific practices. So sniffing roses or some sort of rose powder or oil has been pretty effective, I think, for relaxing different parts of the body. I never choose the things that might potentially do me harm. I must say I've steered away from any of the opium-based sedatives, but all those things that are sort of still with us, thermal regulation, regulation of light, what am I doing in the immediate run-up to bedtime, and could I be doing something that's better for me, are all things that have stayed with me since I've started doing this research.
Absolutely,
and that's quite a nice link to some of the public engagement projects that we've run over the past few years, where we've introduced just like regular members of the public to some of this work, and they've taken their own sleep lessons out of it and implemented them in their daily life, and think that they feel better for doing it. I can't tell them that physically those things are doing them some good. I certainly hope they're not doing them any harm. But I think it is really useful to confront our past in certain ways, and actually to give early modern communities a bit more credit for the knowledge that they had and how they used it to support their health and well-being. We tend to think that if things are not backed by what we credit as science, then it must all be nonsense, but the incredible amount of continuity between sleep care practices of the past and the advice that we still get today, I think tells you a lesson that these, centuries worth of practical experience and experimentation actually constitutes a body of knowledge that we should take a bit more seriously.
This has been absolutely fascinating, super interesting. I highly recommend anyone who's watching to check out your books. Very enjoyed Sleep in Early Modern England, Visions of an Unseen World, and there is much more.
The new
out
ghost
there.
book will be coming out.
There is a new
soon.
ghost book. Read the new ghost book when that comes out. So yeah, thank you very, very much for joining us.